Eventually, what happens is in drug abusers, they display psychological or physical dependence on the drug, such as, for example, dependence such as cravings, or physical dependence such as they have become tolerant to it, so they actually need to take higher quantities of the drug to actually get the same effect. So here, this is a table that shows the different substances and their effect and the mode of transmission, such as, for example, alcohol is considered a depressant, nicotine is considered a stimulant, cocaine is considered a stimulant, methamphetamine or ecstasy is considered a stimulant, heroin is actually a depressant, and marijuana or K2 is a psychoactive. So alcohol is a depressant. It increases the action of GABA. So this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And depending on the amount that is consumed, this can lead to a feeling of relaxation, lower inhibitions, impaired concentration, coordination, slower speech, and vomiting. And if the blood levels are too high, what happens is that a person can actually end up in coma and they can actually die. So alcohol influences the action of GABA and other neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine in the brain. They primarily metabolize in the liver, where it disrupts the organ's normal workings. Fats cannot be broken down, leading to the fat accumulation. So this is the first stage of liver deterioration, and it usually begins after one night of heavy drinking. So essentially what's happening here is that you're destroying your liver. And essentially that's what happens whenever a person becomes dependent on alcohol. They end up dying because basically they destroy the liver. Stop drinking and he continues to drink heavily, then what happens is that you begin to kill the cells of the liver. So what happens here is that you begin the formation of scar tissue. But there's good news. If a person stops drinking, then your liver might recover. If, however, a person continues to drink, then we go into the final stage, which is basically cirrhosis of the liver. And essentially what happens here is that the liver cell dies, it hardens and it becomes orange. And remember, your liver functions in detoxification of drugs. So basically all the blood that goes from your stomach actually passes through the liver. And so without a liver, then basically you end up dying, essentially. That's what happens. That is addictive. It's nicotine. So nicotine causes the release of epinephrine, so it increases blood sugar and causes an initial feeling of stimulation. So a person feels good initially whenever they take nicotine. But then what happens is that as blood sugar falls, the depression and fatigue set in. And so what happens here is that the person starts to feel not so good. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, but then when I took nicotine, I felt good, so I'm going to take some more. So essentially what happens here is that it stimulates neurons to release dopamine. And if you guys remember, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is important for the pleasure. And so about 70% of people who try smoking become addicted. So this is why basically taking nicotine, it's addictive. Again, about 70% of people who try smoking become addicted to it. Again, it initially makes you feel good, but then it makes you feel crappy, and that's why a person continues to seek more and more. Becoming dependent or becoming addicted to nicotine, there's also other terrible consequences to smoking, and that is smoking is strongly linked with serious diseases of the cardiovascular and respiratory system. And once a person is addicted, only about 10 to 20% of the smokers are able to quit. And here I would like to say one more thing is, one of the things or one of the reasons why it's really hard to quit smoking or to quit drinking or to quit, just that you create really strong memories of that, like that pleasure of feeling, if you will. And even if you stop drinking or if you stop smoking, right, if you basically have an outside stimulant, just for example, you see a commercial or you hear, the word alcohol or something like that, it's going to trigger those memories that make you feel good, and it's going to trigger for you to want to smoke or want to drink again. So let's talk about cocaine and crack. So both of them are powerful stimulants, and what they do is they interfere with the reuptake of dopamine at the synapse. So what happens is normally dopamine is released in the synapse, and it's basically taken back up by the neuron in order to be used again. However, what happens with cocaine and crack is that they actually bind to the receptors. The receptors are going to reuptake dopamine, so that way dopamine can spend more time in the synapse. And basically what happens here is that this results in a sense of well-being that lasts from 50 to 30 minutes. But then what happens after that is it's followed by fatigue, depression, and irritability. And essentially, you're gonna see that with a lot of the drugs. Essentially, you start by feeling good first, and then you collapse. And basically, that's a way of you getting addicted because you want to go back to using the drugs so that way you can feel better again. So one of the things about cocaine and crack is that long-term use of cocaine causes the loss of metabolic function of the brain. So essentially, what happens here is that you're killing your neurons essentially. Crack, it's the street name given to the cocaine that is processed in the form for smoking. It's super addictive, so that users usually experience withdrawal symptoms and intense craving for cocaine. So they want more and more. And overdosing on cocaine can cause cardiac or respiratory arrest. So essentially, the person just dies. Methamphetamine and ecstasy are powerful stimulants. These are produced a lot of times in laboratories, in clandestine laboratories. They're available as a powder that can be smoked or as a crystal that can be smoked. And what happens here is that the user gets a rush of euphoria, energy, alertness, and elevated mood. And of course, then this is followed by a collapse. And what happens is the user becomes agitated and sometimes becomes violent. Now, chronic use will result in psychosis, and this is pronounced by having paranoia, hallucinations, irritability, and erratic behavior. So a person basically just loses control and begins to hallucinate, begins to have really weird thoughts. Heroin is derived from the opium poppy plant, and the drugs that are derived from the opium are called opiates. And some examples of these are morphine and codeine. And what happens here is that it causes feelings of euphoria along with relief of pain. So this is, to be honest with you, are actually used, to relieve pain. And but one of the problems that comes to it is that they can become highly addictive. Continue talking more about heroin. So what happens here is that it binds to endorphins receptors, and then with repeated use, the production of endorphins decreases. And then what happens here is that you have tolerance, and so you need to take more heroin to prevent withdrawal symptoms such as tremors, restlessness, cramps, or vomiting. And often what happens is that the users acquire HIV, hepatitis, and other diseases, and that's caused because of neurosharing. And addiction can be treated with synthetic opiates such as methadone. Marijuana can be ingested by usually smoke in cigarettes called joints, and the user experience euphoria along with alterations in vision and judgment. If marijuana is heavily used, this can cause hallucinations, anxiety, depression, paranoia, and psychosis. K2, it's a synthetic compound about 10 times as potent as THC, and it's typically sprayed onto mixtures of their herbal products, and basically people usually smoke it.